Unlike most of the others with whom I had been at circumcision school, I was not destined to work in the gold mines on the reef. The regent had often told me, "It is not for you to spend your life mining the white man's gold, never knowing how to write your name." My destiny was to become a counselor to Sabata, and for that I had to be educated. I returned to Mikisveni after the ceremony, but not for very long, for I was about to cross the Mabashi River for the first time on my way to Clarkbury Boarding Institute in the district of Incubo. I was again leaving home, but I was eager to see how I would fare in the wider world. The regent himself drove me to Incubo in his majestic Ford V8. Before leaving, he had organized a celebration for my having passed Standard 5 and being admitted to Clarkbury. A sheep was slaughtered and there was dancing and singing. It was the first celebration that I had ever had in my own honor, and I greatly enjoyed it. The regent gave me my first pair of boots, a sign of manhood, and that night I polished them anew, even though they were already shiny. Founded in 1825, the Clarkbury Institute was located on the site of one of the oldest Wesleyan missions in the Transkei. At the time, Clarkbury was the highest institution of learning for Africans in Tambuland. The regent himself had attended Clarkbury and justice had followed him there. It was both a secondary school and a teacher training college, but it also offered courses in more practical disciplines such as carpentry, tailoring, and tinsmithing. During the trip, the regent advised me on my behavior and my future. He urged me to behave in a way that brought only respect to Sabata and to himself. I assured him that I would. He then briefed me on the Reverend C. Harris, the governor of the school. Reverend Harris, he explained, was unique. He was a white Thambu, a white man who in his heart loved and understood the Thambu people. The regent said when Sabata was older, he would entrust the future king to Reverend Harris, who would train him as both a Christian and a traditional ruler. He said that I must learn from Reverend Harris because I was destined to guide the leader that Reverend Harris was to mold. At Mikisveni, I had met many white traders and government officials, including magistrates and police officers. These were men of high standing, and the regent received them courteously, but not obsequiously. He treated them on equal terms as they did him. At times, I even saw him upbraid them, though this was extremely rare. I had very little experience in dealing directly with whites. The regent never told me how to behave, and I observed him and followed his example. In talking about Reverend Harris, however, the regent for the first time gave me a lecture on how I was to conduct myself. He said I must afford the Reverend the same respect and obedience that I gave to him. Clarkbury was far grander even than Migisveni. The school itself consisted of a cluster of 24 or so graceful colonial style buildings, which included individual homes as well as dormitories, the library, and various instructional halls. It was the first place I had lived that was Western, not African, and I felt I was entering a new world whose rules were not yet clear to me. We were taken into Reverend Harris's study, where the regent introduced me and I stood to shake his hand, the first time I had ever shaken hands with a white man. Reverend Harris was warm and friendly and treated the regent with great deference. The regent explained that I was being groomed to be a counselor to the king and that he hoped the Reverend would take a special interest in me. The Reverend nodded, adding that Clarksbury students were required to do manual labor after school hours, and he would arrange for me to work in his garden. At the end of the interview, the regent bade me goodbye and handed me a pound note for pocket money, the largest amount of money I had ever possessed. I bade him farewell and promised that I would not disappoint him. Clarksbury was a Thambu college, founded on land given by the great Thambu king Negubenchuka. As a descendant of Negubenchuka, I presumed that I would be accorded the same deference at Clarkbury that I had come to expect in Migisveni. But I was painfully mistaken, for I was treated no differently from anyone else. No one knew or even cared that I was a descendant of the illustrious Negubenchuka. The housemaster received me without a blowing of trumpets, and my fellow students did not bow and scrape before me. At Claresbury, plenty of the boys had distinguished lineages, and I was no longer unique. This was an important issue, for I suspect I was a bit stuck up in those days. I quickly realized that I had to make my way on the basis of my ability, not my heritage. Most of my classmates could outrun me on the playing field and outthink me in the classroom. And I had a good deal of catching up to do. Classes commenced the following morning, and along with my fellow students, I climbed the steps to the first floor where the classrooms were located. The room itself had a beautifully polished wooden floor. On this first day of classes, I sported my new boots. I had never worn boots before of any kind, and that first day I walked like a newly shod horse. I made a terrible racket walking up the steps and almost slipped several times. As I climbed into the classroom, my boots crashing on that shiny wood floor, I noticed two female students in the first row were watching my lame performance with great amusement. The prettier of the two leaned over to her friend and said loud, enough for all to hear, "The country boy is not used to wearing shoes," at which her friend laughed. I was blind with fury and embarrassment. Her name was Mathona, and she was a bit of a smart aleck. That day I vowed never to talk to her. But as my mortification wore off, and I became more adept at walking with boots, I also got to know her, and she was to become my greatest friend at Claresbury. She was my first true female friend, a woman I met on equal terms with whom I could confide and share secrets. In many ways, she was the model for all my subsequent friendships with women. For with women, I found I could let my hair down and confess to weaknesses and fears I would never reveal to another man. I soon adapted to life at Claresbury. I participated in sports and games as often as I could, but my performances were no more than mediocre. I played for the love of sport, not the glory, for I received none. We played lawn tennis with homemade wooden rackets and soccer with bare feet on a field of dust. For the first time, I was taught by teachers who had themselves been properly educated. Several of them held university degrees, which was extremely rare. One day, I was studying with Mathona, and I confided to her my fear that I might not pass my exams in English and history at the end of the year. She told me not to worry because our teacher, Gertrude Nithabai, was the first African woman to obtain a BA. She is too clever to let us fail. Mathona said, I had not yet learned to feign knowledge that I did not possess, and as I had only a vague idea what a BA was, I questioned Mathona. Oh yes, of course, she answered. A BA is a very long and difficult book. I did not doubt her. Another African teacher with a Bachelor of Arts degree was Ben Mandela. We admired him not only because of his academic achievement, but because he was not intimidated by Reverend Harris. Even the white faculty behaved in a servile manner to Reverend Harris. But Mr. Mandela would walk into the Reverend's office without fear, and sometimes would even fail to remove his hat. He met the Reverend on equal terms, disagreeing with him where others simply assented. Though I respected Reverend Harris, I admired the fact that Mr. Mandela would not be cowed by him. In those days, a black man with a BA was expected to scrape before a white man with a primary school education. No matter how high a black man advanced, he was still considered inferior to the lowest white man. Reverend Harris ran Claresbury with an iron hand and an abiding sense of fairness. Claresbury functioned more like a military school than a teacher training college. The slightest infractions were swiftly punished. In assemblies, Reverend Harris always wore a forbidding expression and was not given to levity of any kind. When he walked into a room, members of the staff, including white principals of the training and secondary schools, together with the black principal of the industrial school, rose to their feet. Among students, he was feared more than loved. But in the garden, I saw a different Reverend Harris. Working in his garden had a double benefit. It planted in me a lifelong love of gardening and growing vegetables. And it helped me get to know the Reverend and his family, the first white family with whom I had ever been on intimate terms. In that way, I saw that Reverend Harris had a public face and a private manner that were quite different from one another. Behind the Reverend's mask of civility was a gentle, broad-minded individual who believed fervently in the importance of educating young Africans. Often, I found him lost in thought in his garden. I did not disturb him and rarely talked to him. But as an example of a man unselfishly devoted to a good cause, Reverend Harris was an important model for me. His wife was as talkative as he was taciturn. She was a lovely woman and she would often come into the garden to chat with me. I cannot for the life of me remember what we talked about, but I can still taste the delicious warm scones that she brought out to me in the afternoon. After my slow and undistinguished start, I managed to get the hang of things and accelerated my program, completing the junior certificate in 2 years instead of the usual 3. I developed the reputation of having a fine memory. But in fact, I was simply a diligent worker. When I left Clarksbury, I lost track of Mathona. She was a day scholar, and her parents did not have the means to send her for further education. She was an extraordinarily clever and gifted person, whose potential was limited because of her family's meager resources. This was an all too typical South African story. It was not lack of ability that limited my people, but lack of opportunity. My time at Clarksbury broadened my horizons, yet I would not say that I was an entirely open-minded, unprejudiced young man when I left. I had met students from all over the Transkei, as well as a few from Johannesburg and Basutoland, as Lesotho was then known, some of whom were sophisticated and cosmopolitan in ways that made me feel provincial. Though I emulated them, I never thought it possible for a boy from the countryside to rival them in their worldliness, yet I did not envy them. Even as I left Clarksbury, I was still, at heart, a Thembu, and I was proud to think and act like one. My roots were my destiny, and I believed that I would become a counselor to the Thembu king, as my guardian wanted. My horizons did not extend beyond Thembuland, and I believed that to be a Thembu was the most enviable thing in the world.